Good morning. Just checking to make sure everyone can hear me. If someone could please, one of the attendees can please use the chat box to say that they can hear me. If that's okay. It looks, just one sec guys, I'm just going to just double check to make sure everything's working fine before we commence part two. Okay, I've just got the signal that everything's all good. So welcome to today's second part of the webinar series on our Azure Aligned series. This particular part is talking about migrating services to Azure whilst maintaining control. We've got a fair bit to get through today with this particular webinar. And today, the Xello team, it's not only myself, but we've got James joining us. So James, one of our senior consultants.
Hey guys, how you going? Hope you're having a good day.
Across our Azure business. And James has got an extraordinary amount of experience around migrating services into Azure. And he will talk a little bit today around some of the tools and some of the processes that can support this particular webinar. As normal with housekeeping, anytime ask questions using the chat window and we'll endeavour to answer them. Obviously, we're recording the webinar. So after the webinar is concluded, we will be sending out a link to the recorded version. This particular link will be always on our website, so you can feel free to come back at any time to get access to it. And obviously, we'll send a feedback form post the webinar to get your feedback. And yeah, and we hope that you enjoy this particular part of the series. So we did a bit of a poll leading up to this webinar to all attendances that was going to join us today. And what was interesting to find out was, you know, where are people at with their migration and disaster recovery and monitoring optimization plans. And as you can see that there's not many people that are currently using the Azure Cloud or have a migration plan in place, which is kind of interesting. However, you know, a fair bit do have a BC or DR as well, or the same amount, sorry, I should say. And then, you know, most customers, when they do go into Azure, then they do leverage monitoring and optimization, which is great to see, because obviously, you know, a key part to, you know, migrating services into Azure and maintaining control is to make sure that you've got the monitoring and optimization and the security framework in place to be able to ensure that you're secured and it's monitored, and especially the billing aspects as it is pay as you go. And you need to make sure that you keep that optimization cadence kind of going. So there's never been a better time to migrate to Azure. So we often speak to customers around, you know, the time for them and when is it right and when is it not right. And what we've seen is that there's a number of different triggers that customers look at in relation to when they do go to cloud and when they do go to Azure, when they don't. So most customers have a cloud-first strategy, and most customers are really looking to migrate to Azure in the future. But the actual migration effort to migrate workloads and to migrate services into Azure is dictated by, you know, more of a business trigger. You know, and that trigger, you know, can sometimes be, you know, isolated to, you know, a hardware refresh cycle, or, you know, at the moment, you know, Microsoft's pushing a lot of the end of support for Server and SQL 2008, and the benefits for migrating to Azure from the perspective of, you know, receiving free support for 3 years. You know, there's some triggers, but, you know, there's also other triggers around security and compliance, and there's also, you know, triggers as to, you know, taking advantage of some of the more advanced services within Azure, you know, such as whether or not it's, you know, microservices, or whether or not it's, you know, data and AI type services. That normally underpins a migration trigger, and we kind of touched on some of those aspects in the last webinar in the part 1 series. So it's good to have one of these triggers when you go to full-blown migration, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to wait for the trigger. So we see that there's a lot of opportunity to do certain migration efforts, even if there's not a real business trigger at a particular point in time. When we talk about proven migration methodology, I'm going to touch on this and then I'm going to hand it over to James to talk about some of the tooling and all that kind of stuff. But we kind of talked about this in the last series or in part 1, where we talk about the process around the assessing phase to ensure that we assess the environment, ensure that we've got that decision-making framework set up, and ensure that we've got the key processes in place to be able to assess. And then we've got the processes to migrate, and then we've got that process to optimize, and then we've got that process to secure and manage. And we'll go through these four parts as part of this webinar and really look at each of the parts in details around the different tools, different options, the decision-making framework, and then how that ultimately comes back down to the optimization. So if you remember, if you were in the part 1 series last week, I talked a lot about ensuring that you've got that baseline set up and you've got that forecast set up ahead of time as part of the strategy. And then when you migrate, you optimize in accordance to that framework. So we're going to talk about some of the techniques around optimization and some of the tools that you can use for that today. And then there's that ongoing secure and management to make sure that things are secure and where some of the tools and some of the processes around security and management comes in to the picture. But for now, I'm going to hand over to James to talk a little bit about tooling and his experience around migration and the assessment part and the migration part and the optimization part. And then I'll also jump in as part of it to be able to also add my comments.
All right. So when you are starting to migrate, starting to plan your journey through Azure and the cloud service as a whole, you'll generally go through an assess phase at the start. Now, if you go back to that survey that we showed at the start of the webinar, you would note that there's about 70% of organisations who have a cloud first strategy but not a dedicated plan. So there's a trigger obviously to move to cloud, to move a service, move it to cloud, and they go, well, I'm going to assess it then, but there's not a plan, and it's not I'm going to get my whole data center in there and this is how I'm going to do it step by step. So that's really, something that we find a lot of our customers are missing, and where a lot of the built-in Azure services for data migration and for cloud migration work in. So you've obviously got your first step. So you've got Azure Migrate, which will do your VMware services into Azure, and that's really just a full what have I got now on a virtual machine? Can I lift and shift it into Azure, and what's that going to look like? Azure Migrate's really good in the way that it'll give you a breakdown of what sizes are recommended. So if you've got a beefy SQL server on premise, it's going to look at that at the VMware or Hyper-V layer and go, well, this within Azure, this is going to be an F series. It's going to cost you this much. If you want to minimize that cost, you want to bring it down, you can look at the following reserved instances. You can look at the following, sizing changes if you don't want to just move the size straight across. So that's really your full lift and shift one. You've got stuff like the SQL Server Migration Assistant and Data Migration Assistant, which kind of really help you to move in a transformative way, right? So rather than just lifting and shifting your services into Azure, you actually go, all right, well, I have PaaS services in the cloud, and this is where the cloud really excels in reducing your running costs. I have these PaaS services. How can I move my existing on-premise infrastructure into PaaS? So a great example is databases. You've got a lot of databases, on-premise, and a lot of different ways to move them into the cloud environment. So you can assess that at the start. Once you've got a holistic picture of how your environment actually looks and what it would look like in the cloud, you can start to move into the migrate phase. Again, there's a lot of platform native tools. The one that we probably use the most at Xello, at least, is Azure Site Recovery, because it plays into that original question of, do you have a BCDR strategy, right? So a lot of companies will say, oh yeah, I have a DR strategy, I have a business continuity strategy, but they'll only have one from on-premise data center 1 to their DR data center. They'll only have one from cloud service, in Melbourne to cloud service in Sydney. It doesn't matter where, but they've got one between two sites. Now, one of the really good advantages of ASR, at least for migration purposes, is you can set up an on-premise to cloud site recovery. And that's really good for just a migration, because you say, well, I'm going to set up my DR, I'm going to expand my existing DR capability, but I'm also going to enable future migration into the cloud at the click of a button. With an express route and a properly optimized network, we've seen failover times of around 3 minutes for a service, which is better than most backup services out there. You've got data migration service to get, or database migration service to get your SQL or MySQL databases into the cloud and transform them into the PaaS services. And then if you've got a large amount of data, like for archiving purposes, for long-term retention, you can look at using stuff like Databox. You might have 10 years of historical information. You don't need it readily available at every day, but you might need to move it into the cloud service. Your SAN's failing, or you need to get rid of that hardware. So you can use Databox to do that. And once you get into the cloud, you've kind of got to a point where everything's there, and you realize, at least in the cloud, you're going to pay for everything, right? So no one cries for you in the cloud. You just get the bill at the end of the month, and you go, oh, okay, I need to pay this now. And if you've done your assess phase right at the start, you've used the platform native tools, you will be well prepared for that. But if you're not, you'll be looking at the cost and going, well, all right, how do I minimize that? And that's where Azure Cost Management comes in, and that's really available throughout the platform. It's everywhere. You can get cost breakdown by resource group, by subscription, by resource, and it depends on your cost management strategy. So you can tag out your resources and say, well, I've tagged these resources as my finance department. What do they actually cost me out? So you can start to do business charge back and that sort of stuff. You can also go and look and say, well, I've tagged these resources as SQL, and they're running on infrastructure as a service. How do I minimize that into a PaaS service if I haven't already done that? And then you've got your ongoing security and management of your cloud services. So Azure's really, really good at adopting the modern security perimeter. So if you're talking modern security, you're actually talking identity as a perimeter. If you're used to an old school data center, you're probably used to a really gnarly firewall on the outside, lots of ingress, egress rules, and then all your defenses pointing out. The reality of cloud in general is that from a security perspective, you actually broaden your network footprint. You expand in with, adding in PaaS services that are globally reachable, adding in mobile devices and workers who can actually work from anywhere, right? They can log in at home and just get to all their services. So from a security perspective, Azure AD is really great to extend out your perimeter to be identity focused. So you only allow people who are actually authorized using identity to access those resources. You have Azure Blueprints, Azure Policy and Security Center, which really assist you with the day-to-day management of your environment and also security prevention. So if you've got something and for your business that doesn't fit your risk profile, you can use you can use Azure Policy to restrict that behavior. So for example, I've got an Azure environment and I don't want anything to be deployed outside of Australia. I have a regulatory requirement. I need it in Australia. So you can define a policy and say, well, across my entire cloud service, nothing is allowed outside of Australia. If you are looking to move really quickly with Azure deployments, you can look at using Blueprints. So Blueprints is a really useful tool, similar to CloudFormation in AWS, where you can declare out what an environment looks like, click the deploy button, and it's just there. There's a lot of these already pre-canned for different compliance requirements in the security space. So you can look at GDPR ones, PCI DSS, and they just pre-deploy the whole environment and say, this is already compliant to this regulatory requirement. And then Security Center is really useful, at least for telling you what's wrong, right? So at a base level, you're going to get platform level metrics without doing any work. So you just turn it on and there you go. It goes, well, you haven't got encrypted disks here, or you haven't got NSGs applied throughout your Azure environment. You can expand Security Center to cover Azure resources at the machine level. So you can say, I'd like you to look at, what's my Windows server? Is it misconfigured? Have I got an issue? Do I have an issue with my Linux server? The other really cool thing with the Azure Security Center is you can actually extend it across cloud and across site. So you can deploy Security Center, you can deploy the agents into AWS, that'll work fine. You can deploy them on-premise as well. So the platform native tools alone give you a really broad capability to manage and secure your environment. And then there's obviously third-party assessment, migration, and management tools, right? So from an assessment perspective, you might look at something like Mover and go, all right, well, this is going to tell me what I need from a sizing perspective and how I can maintain that sizing and optimize my cost. Mover is really good at doing that. You've got migration tools such as Xello, which will help you lift and shift from on-premise into the cloud. And then if you want to look at continuous config management and that sort of stuff, you can look at your other platform or cloud native tools such as Chef and move on from there. But there's a whole range of that sort of stuff depending on what you're doing within the cloud space. So back to that assess bit earlier, one of the key ones for your assessment at the start is using Azure Migrate. So you can plug that into your VMware cluster. It'll tell you, what you need in Azure, what the sizing should look like, the costing, and the dependencies. That's currently supported for production in VMware, and it's in preview for Hyper-V. Obviously, there's a big push to get off VMware for a lot of cloud customers into a cloud service. So that was obviously the first focus from Microsoft. If something works in Hyper-V, 9 times out of 10, it's going to work in Azure anyway because it's built on Hyper-V under the hood. For a assess phase, you're probably going to look at how you move your IaaS into Azure. So having a decision framework on how you move that IaaS is really critical to planning out accurately. So your end goal for a lot of cloud services is often SaaS. And the reason for SaaS is it gives you the lowest maintenance level. So, your vendor looks after it. If you're deploying that SaaS product, it's all their responsibility and you're kind of just focusing on the data and who has access to the data. And your next best option is going to be PaaS. So you want to use platform-specific tools. So the advantage of PaaS and SaaS is they take away a lot of your day-to-day operations in the on-premise environment. You don't have to deal with it. So for example, SQL managed instance, you just get the database, right? And you don't have to deal with any of that nasty failover clustering or Windows host maintenance that comes along with your traditional IaaS SQL. If your application or service can't be refactored, you can then look at rehosting it. And generally, if you've got a robust decision framework, you're actually going to rehost it with a plan to move. So you'll rehost it and you go, well, in 6 months, I've got a refactoring, or at this time, we're going to look at a SaaS offering for that product. So you generally have a couple migration scenarios. You want to either rehost, refactor, re-architect, which is your migration modernization scenario. That's generally transformative, and it's going to lead to your existing environment being moved to the cloud at the minimal cost for that existing environment. Then you've got some stuff around doing a cloud native one. So maybe you're looking at your on-premise application, you go, oh, it's a bit iffy. It works, but it could be better. You might elect to rebuild it from the ground up, or you might elect just to completely replace it. So we've got a lot of customers who go, no, I'm not happy with my current implementation. I'd like to rebuild that implementation in the cloud, and they do that. They get the same transformative actions on their environment. Everything's new and improved and cheaper often, but it's all without all of the technical debt that is present in their on-prem environment. And you have some customers who look at just going outright to SaaS, and that's really at the far end of the Microsoft modern desktop arena, where you go, well, I just have my devices, a couple of SaaS applications, and I manage identity and services rather than managing cloud infrastructure. So we mentioned earlier doing rehosting to IaaS using Azure Site Recovery. So Azure Site Recovery is a really, really versatile tool. So you can go on-premise to Azure. You can also do using agents cloud to cloud failover, and it's really powerful in terms of how quickly you can fail services over and the versatility on those services. So you can do a app consistent failover where it actually guarantees that your application will work when you get into the cloud. You can do I'd like the closest possible where it's not really guaranteed, but it might be 30 seconds old data, which is really great for high transacting services. And you can do OS consistent as well, where it'll say, look, we guarantee that the machine will turn on, but we're not too sure about the application on top of it. So at a minimum, you'll get your data into Azure. And then in some cases, for example, SQL using ASR, it can actually guarantee when this is in the cloud, it's going to work. From a testing perspective, you can test in a bubble. So you can actually leave all your services on premise and say, I'd like this to be in the cloud. Test it for me, and it'll bring the entire environment up into your Azure subscription, spin it all up. You can, if it's correctly set up, you can log into that bubble and look at all the services and go, everything works. Okay, I've finished my test, click a delete button, and it all just disappears. It's great from a risk-averse testing and planning perspective for getting into Azure. The database migration service will allow you to get databases off your IaaS and into PaaS platforms, which is really great for just moving your data and going, oh, I don't really want any sort of administrative overhead. And it supports a fairly large set of on-premise databases, and then moves those into the equivalent PaaS service or a transformative. So you've got MongoDB, which is a NoSQL database on premise, and then you'd have Cosmos DB, which is also NoSQL in the cloud. You actually have PaaS services specifically for the other database types like Microsoft SQL, MySQL, Postgres, and that sort of stuff, which is really quite powerful. And then you can look at your refactoring. So we mentioned earlier that there's a lot of ways to move. You can lift and shift, you can refactor your app, you can rebuild the app. Now, if you talk to a lot of developers these days, a lot of app modernization and people, they will tell you, oh, we'd like to use a PaaS service, we'd like to use app services or anything like that, and we'd like to start looking at container technology to do that. Now, the advantage of container technology is it's really small, it's really easy, it's also super cheap. You can run containers for a fraction of the price. And then PaaS services, obviously, app service and that sort of stuff, and stuff that runs on top of app service plans, Azure Functions. You can run websites and the like on app service, and it doesn't cost you nearly half as much as what your IaaS would cost as you move across. So from an optimization perspective, if you've planned this out correctly, you probably have a really good idea at the start of your journey what it's going to look like from a billing perspective. Now, the unfortunate reality of cloud is that the vendor sets the pricing in advance. If you've got an EA, you can kind of guarantee that for a bit, but you might have occasions where you come across a cost and say, what is this? I don't understand, or why is this so expensive? So Azure has built-in cost management tools that allow you to visualize and understand how your services are being used and when they're being used for what. So you can look at it and go, well, all right, my SQL service is using a lot of storage. How do I minimize that? Maybe I put it in PaaS now because it actually costs me 3 times as much. It's really helpful to provide that information back to your business and say, hey guys, I know when we moved to the cloud originally, you told us we don't want to refactor this app. With cost management, you can say, well, I'm quite happy to leave this app and not refactor it. But I'd also like to, push the following business case where, my SQL instance is costing me $1,200 a month. On a PaaS service at an equivalent size, that might go down to $400 a month. So that cost management tool allows you really to, drill into how the costs are being there, and also provides you the ammunition you need to go back to your business and say, I'd like to improve this service for you guys. I'd like to make it more resilient. I'd like to, get more bang for my buck in the cloud environment. So from a security perspective, I mentioned earlier that the identity really is the new perimeter in the cloud space. It's, you're focusing on authorizing people into services. There's also a lot of other platform native tools that allow you to secure both on-premise and your platform, as a cloud. So from a governance perspective, you're looking at using Azure policy, tagging resource groups to define out, who can do what, where they can do it, and then identify what each section of your cloud is for. From a security perspective, you've got a lot. If you want to look into the security graph API, it integrates into literally everything. You can do it multi-cloud, you can do it Azure, you can do it identity. It doesn't matter. It's there. And you've got services like ATP, which are tuned using AI and machine learning to actually plug into, on-premise. So for example, ATP right now, if you plug it into your on-premise domain controllers, it'll actually tell you live, if something's happening on your network that you should be concerned about. From a resiliency point of view, you can look at using ASR again and Azure Backup to maintain data protection and do high availability across sites. So one of the really cool things we see with a lot of our customers is getting rid of the second DR data center. So your traditional on-premise setup is you have one location where you're running your prod workloads, and then you have a secondary location that you fail over to in case of emergency. So using Azure native services like ASR, you can actually say, look, I'm a Melbourne-based organization. I'd like to run my services in Melbourne, but in a DR scenario, I'd like these to still remain up. So you can configure ASR to go from Azure to Azure. So in a DR scenario, you'd say, well, if Melbourne goes down, I want this in Sydney, right? And you can use ASR to do that. You can use things like availability groups and zones to actually ensure that within Melbourne alone, you have resiliency on how your hardware is placed out. From a monitoring perspective, you've got the log analytics, OMS workspaces, which really allow you to deep dive into platform metrics, device metrics, and the like. And then you've got automation on top of that. So you can use Azure Functions, Azure Automation, Logic Apps to tie into that monitoring and then remediate on the fly automatically, removing all of the nasty manual maintenance that a lot of engineers are actually going to have to look after. So from a best practices thing, we generally find that planning is key. So get your assessment done early, work out what it's going to look like. You're also going to decide on the, what technologies you use, and you might do pilots for those technologies and go, well, this does work for me, this doesn't work for me. And the second big one we find for a lot of companies is getting your people on the journey. So you need to drive the culture change. You need to get those people trained, because fundamentally cloud services are a different way of thinking. You have to adapt and you have to move a lot quicker. There's a lot more configuration, and often if you don't configure it right, there's a lot more that can go wrong because it's someone else's product that you're using, and if you don't understand it properly, you're going to have trouble. So from a governance perspective, for best practice, we say you should 100% configure up Azure policy and look at using Azure blueprints. So you can configure up policy across your entire environment and make sure that, you have guardrails and you can't get over them, you can't get around them. You need to work within those guardrails. It really helps you from a cost management perspective to say, I've got a policy preventing, H-series VMs being deployed, which are going to cost you upwards of $1,000 a month, because it works. If you're using Azure blueprints, you say, well, I've already got this blueprint and I deployed it into my cloud services. It's compliant with my existing regulations, right? So I can deploy that and then go, all right, well, now I'm using my migration services, ASR or whatever, to put stuff into that pre-compliant environment. And the policy will say, when you put it in, this is not compliant with regulation, and immediately to fix it. So Azure blueprints and policy really benefits a lot of organizations in that space. This one here is the Microsoft reference for Azure design and governance, right? So they recommend that you put a governance program in place across your entire Azure deployment, right? All the way from the EA or your account up through your resources. So you're looking at subscriptions, you're looking at resource groups, more often than not, you'll be linking your policy and governance at those levels and applying them all to all child resources. But you have to consider what's right for your organization across all of that. So tagging is a good one to enforce. Basic VM security, you can enforce the whole way down from your EA all the way across all your subscriptions, provided it's set up correctly. From a networking and identity perspective, there's two real, beneficial extensions. I would look at, for all my customers, putting in an express route. So that is a dedicated link between yourself and the Azure Cloud. It has to go through a partner, but it's all secured end to end. It's the equivalent of a old school IPsec VPN, and that really gives you dedicated bandwidth, dedicated security, encrypted end to end. And then from an identity perspective, you're going to look at chucking in AD Connect and extending out to Azure AD in that hybrid model. At some point, you might, if you finally get to the end goal of having all SaaS, all identity, you can say, well, I don't need AD Connect anymore. I could just use Azure AD and that native capability built in there. So from a afterthoughts perspective, you find a lot of companies, they forget about these and they go, oh, I've got a cloud first strategy. I'm just going to get it there. I'm going to move it there. And then, when they're there, they go, oh, I've got all these problems. So these are our afterthoughts and key takeaways. The big one for your technical teams is making sure they're educated. So sometimes you'll have a team, Xello comes in and they move your services into Azure for you, and the technical team will do a handover with them. We'll say, here you go, guys. And they understand how to manage the platform, but if they wanted to extend it or build on it, they're like, oh, I don't really feel comfortable with this. So education is really huge when you're moving to the cloud things. You need to manage your compliance requirements, understand what industry you sit in. Are you in health? Are you in financial services? Are you in government? Do you have requirements for compliance, in cloud services? Cloud spend and consumption, security issues, and selecting the right tool for the right job. So you might look at a platform native tool and go, oh, that's not great for me as a company, but there's a third-party tool that can do that for you.
Yeah, and tool selection is probably a key part.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, James. So just to wrap up the webinar, so for some additional resources, we've got some great resources on our website around cloud ROI and some white papers, so feel free to have a bit of a look at that. Obviously, next week, this time we talk about lowering Azure spend with strong governance, and we talk about 7 steps to strong governance within that particular part. Obviously, on our website, last week's webinar around how to demonstrate ROI in an Azure business case is already on there as an on-demand webinar now. This particular one, version 2, will be saved as well, and links will be kind of sent out post this event. And thank you very much. So the fact that we've got no questions and we've slightly gone over time, I really appreciate everyone joining us today. And we'll be in contact in relation to those links around where you can find this particular presentation on demand, and hope to see you next week in the governance section. Thank you very much and have a great day.